the most important history book that was written in the second half of the 20th century is Anthony C. Sutton's three-volume work titled Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. It breaks this subject up into three parts, basically going from 1917 to 1930, 1930 to 1945, and then from 1945 to 1960, where his study ends. Sutton was not a political person. He was a researcher that was hired by the Hoover Institution, and he was an anti-communist. He was a good anti-communist, just like he should have been, being a citizen of the United States. He was born in Britain, but I don't know when he got American citizenship. But as a good American, he was an anti-communist, and he became concerned with the transfer of Western technological advances to the Soviet Union in the 1960s and into the 1970s. And during the Vietnam War, he was particularly upset at how the Soviet Union was transferring materiel and technology to Vietnam, which was then being used, North Vietnam, which was then being used against American soldiers. So as he saw it, this was very improper. We're giving things away to our enemies and getting our own soldiers killed. So he began what turned into a lifelong investigation that had not been carried out by anyone before that and has been carried out by many people since that, but no one has equaled the scholarly presentation that he did in these three books from the mid to late 1960s. So plenty of people have talked about this, and I heard about this book from Matthew Raphael Johnson. I heard about it from Nick Mason. I heard about it from Tim Kelly and Joe Atwill. And the reason why all these guys are talking about this set of three books is because it utterly explodes the traditional American historical narrative of the 20th century, and it also explodes the conceit of liberalism and capitalism, and shows you who and what the industrialist mindset is really about. Shows you who these people are and what they're actually capable of doing and what they actually did. So I'm only going to mention a few points, and I heard about this book and the content, and it was described by the people I just mentioned, but until you read it yourself, you won't really understand the impact of this work. I have read most of all three volumes. They're written in a very engaging and easy style. It's not a difficult book to read, and conveniently each chapter is almost like a self-contained article with a conclusion at the end. The chapters are organized mostly by industry, such as airplanes, electrification, oil and gas, sheet metal, trucks, things like that. So you can pick up one of these books, which you can download from archive.org for free as a PDF, and you can read one chapter a night or one chapter a day and eventually get through the whole series pretty quickly. And it's very engaging, as I said, so you'll easily be able to read one chapter. But even after having read most of this material, I am still shocked when I turn over each new page. It has not yet lost its ability to shock me. So, for example, one of the first things that I read that shocked me was that the Soviet economy. So basically, just to wrap it up first, the background is that during and after the Russian Civil War, most of the skilled laborers, almost all the managers, and a lot of the scientists and engineers left the country or were killed. So Sutton takes great pains to point out that the factories themselves were not destroyed by the Civil War. The machinery was all still there. It wasn't carried off or looted or sold or anything like that. But the Bolsheviks had no one to use the machinery or the equipment. So even though prior to the Russian Civil War, the Imperial Tsarist Russia had its own native airplane industry, and its own engineers who were on the cutting edge of developing new aircraft. All those people left the country. So now Russia has gone back into the Stone Age in terms of aircraft development. Even if they have the tools in the factory, they don't even know how to use them, right? It was so bad that in the 1920s, some people who were put in charge of big operations, like a guy who was put in charge of a metallurgical plant, was a textile mill operator. So he had basic factory expertise, but no expertise whatsoever in metals. A guy who was put in charge of, I think, one of the tractor plants was a barber. So they got these positions because they were Communist Party members, but they had absolutely no expertise in the field. So you can't build a plant that's supposed to manufacture 5,000 tractors a year if you're a barber. You don't even know where to begin. So that was the situation that the Bolsheviks found themselves in. And then what they had to do was hire Western engineers, scientists, and industrial planners. Now, the conceit that we were all taught, that I know I was taught, is that capitalism and communism are opposing ideologies and have been so for most of the 20th century. And that there was a titanic world struggle to see whether capitalism or communism would win control of the populations of the world, the industrial output, and the hearts and minds of the people. And that was all nonsense, because as early as 17, 18, and 19, these Western capitalists and bankers, these industrialists, were fleeing to Russia in order to secure concessions. They did it in those days, they did it in the 20s, 30s, and starting about 1941, that was one of the first years in which the Soviet government, and this is post-Bolshevik, of course, it's very much into the Stalinist era. 1940 and 41 were some of the first years in which the Soviet government, the Stalinist government, had rebuilt the engineering and manufacturing base that had evaporated and disappeared as a result of the Bolshevik takeover in the Russian Civil War. So it took them that long, took them about 20 years to rebuild everything, and they only did it with gigantic help from America and Britain first and foremost, but also France, Germany, and Italy. So the Germans, even up until 1932 and 1933, were working in Russia, selling them all kinds of advanced components, and of course creating their war industry. But nobody did more than the United States, and following after them it was Britain. We know that this, and it was so bad that the Soviets would do things like in the 1930s, they would spend $4 million US, which was a ton of money, of course, in the 1930s, trying to build a hydroelectric dam. And then they get scared that they're going to mess it up. They bring the Americans over, and the Americans look at the spot and say, you can't even build the dam here. All this work's been wasted. It was so bad that the Soviets spent 2 years, I think, working on a tractor plant before they brought the Americans over, because they didn't know what to do. And the Americans looked at it and said, all you guys have done is stake out a spot on the ground where you want the factory built, and that took you 2 years. The Soviet government was incapable, I'm telling you, absolutely incapable of producing a domestic tractor. They could not build a tractor. They built some engines for tractors that couldn't operate tractors, so they ended up just using the engines as power plants. So everything came from America. And after about 10 or 15 years of this, the Soviets got quite good at imitating Western designs. Everything would be of an inferior quality, but at least they could imitate it. And then eventually they got to the point in 1940, 1941 where they could imitate things that were good enough to work. So you and I were told as young people that the Russians, were this great technological country, and I think Sutton has a line in his book about how the powers were loosed by socialism. It unleashed all this human potential, and none of that was true. Absolutely none of it was true. The Soviet space program was something that was always pointed out as saying, look at how technologically adept the Russians are, the Soviets rather. So even though they have a horrible gulag country and no freedoms, and they're run by dictators and all this kind of thing, and they're godless and all that, they can still have technological achievements. And now I haven't seen it written, but I'm pretty sure by this point that the Soviet space program was probably the work of captured German technology and probably even captured German scientists after World War II. That I think the Soviets captured Peenemünde and that V2 center that was there. So I'm pretty sure that both. Of course, we know about Operation Paperclip and the American space program, but it seems to me that either all of the stuff in America was getting shipped right over to Russia for their space program, but it seems like they also must have had some captured German scientists and naturally could capture technology. But so they couldn't create anything new, and they were having trouble imitating. So the entire Cold War could have been stopped, ended with the stopping all the transfer of technological materials, bank loans so that these people can buy all this American equipment. It's all made up. It's completely fictional. The Cold War was a PR stunt from people like Henry Luce and C.D. Jackson and Eisenhower and all these other folks who wanted to create conditions in America, just like with 9/11 and the War on Terror. If we have the population scared, then we can control them easier or implement some kind of measures that we'll find advantageous or financially remunerative. But I'm straying from the topic here. The point that I wanted to make by talking about this is that these books are so interesting and so dissident that they deserve to be read by you, even if you've already heard about them before, even if you already more or less know what's in them. It will shock you. It really will. Every time you look at one of the industries that he's covering in a chapter of this book, you see the same story over and over again. Okay, so maybe next year or this year, if it hasn't already passed, we need to celebrate Antony Sutton's birthday, because without these books, we would be terribly deceived. We would be deceived about our own leaders, and we would be deceived about the capabilities of Marxism, socialism, and about the actual activities of the Bolshevik government. All right. Thank you for your time.